Well, thank you all for coming out today, on a Friday, no less, at the afternoon. I hope nobody falls asleep. I've been away from BYU and the Kennedy Center for 13 years, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share a small part of what I've been doing during that time. And I'm going to read part of my talk and talk through it a little bit. Argan trees, Argania spinosa, are framed as an endemic tropical relic species in southwest Moroccan coast, which is known as the Sousse. You probably heard about it recently because the Sousse House region was most heavily affected by the earthquake. UNESCO, a human transnational cultural, scientific, and educational organization, designated the Argan forest in southwest Morocco as a biosphere reserve in 1998. Let's see if this works. Okay. The Arganerie forest extends over semi-arid marginal agricultural terrain inhabited by a marginalized ethno-linguistic community known as the Tashelhit Amazigh, sometimes known outside of Morocco as the Berbers. Given the long-standing male migration out of the region, rural Amazigh women have been central to the maintenance of the Amazigh homeland and their relations to Argan trees through culinary oil extraction, firewood collection, animal fodder, shade, and soil stability for barley, which is a key agricultural staple in the region. The women have been key to their relations to the Argan trees have been key to women's emergence as a public essential to conservation and de-desertification in particular. More significantly for the political economy of the tree, a Moroccan phytochemist discovered the chemical basis for its cosmetic affordances in 1984, and in collaboration with L'Oreal, contributed to a global marketing demand for argan oil in hair and facial treatments, whoops, not that one, sorry. Let me look at you've probably seen argan in this format most often. I actually just took this picture at Macy's, by the way. This particular narrative of Argan women relationalities has been key to a gender and development model by which a modernist nation-state capitalizes on its phyto potential to aid rural women and girls through transnational governance and investment. As a narrative framing, this publicly situated account may be most readily naturalized, to borrow a phrase by John Hartigan, and recognizable to many as a public discourse about plant-human relations. The Argan tree, Amazigh women, Moroccan scholars, state-backed businesses, UN agencies tasked with environmental and social conservation, and transnational corporations' clientele are drawn into associations that encourage their mutual, combined, shared, and collective visibility, growth, wealth, and survival. Despite decades of development discourses about the value of Argan for women's education, de-desertification, and ecological conservation efforts, the Argan forest continues to recede. According to a Moroccan colleague of mine, more than half of the forest has disappeared since 1910. Economic and social benefits are not accruing to local communities. You can see this in the work of Travis Libert, who's at UC Davis. And local wildcrafting relations are erased in transnational trade agreements, facilitating global argan consumption. The most famous label for argan is called Moroccan oil, right? Moroccan oil is it is argan oil from Morocco, but it is, I'll talk about this in just a moment, it is packaged, marketed by an Israeli company that has a factory in the West Bank. So there's some really interesting things going on there. Are all of these, like the Argan forest is receding, social benefits and economic benefits are not accruing to local communities, wildcrafting relations are erased in transnational trade agreements, or are they? That's what I'm going to be asking today. And importantly, for my particular interests, what role do Argan trees' communications play in these networks of political, social, environmental relations? Today's talk continues my long-term interest in the semiotics of sociality, or to break it down, the communicative means based in sensory signals, right, by which groups form. In sociological theory of evolution, the tendency to form group associations could be cooperative, often what scholars have focused on, right, that people banded together because it was evolutionary better for them. They could survive better. Or they could be agonistic, a group emphasis on conflict, right? So that they actually formed and banded together because they were in conflict. And that opposition was productive of social relations precisely because of it was divisive. Most studies of sociality or of group formations for action, preservation, or consumption have been what some scholars call conspecific, within a species rather than heterospecific, between species or beings. Ethologists or animal behavior scientists study dolphins, ants, prairie dogs, or horse group formations and communication. Anthropologists, of which I am one, sociologists, linguists, and others study human group formations and communication. Some plant scientists study the social relations of plant groups. For example, Suzanne Simard's work on mother trees and forest ecologies, or John Kelly's work on sea rockets' ability to recognize plant kin and lessen their competition for nutrients in order to help their plant kin survive. So some plant scientists are thinking about this, about sociality of plants. Ecologists study the interconnectedness of multiple species within a specific context, but they tend not to use terms like sociality to explain those relationships or communication because those terms have had a human-centric association for much of their history. And because anthropocentrism, right, humans being the center of the world, was seen to blind scientists to the unique properties and relations of non-human beings. Some scholars in the last few decades, however, have explored multi-species social relations. What kinds of social formations are possible across and between species? My work fits within these approaches. You might ask, how is sociality related to culture, which is the theme of this particular series in the Kennedy Center? Anthropologist John Hartigan has argued that culture is a shared system of group-specific behaviors passed on generationally through social learning. It's in a book he's written about horses and humans in Spain. Now, that was a mouthful, so I'm going to say it again because you probably were like, oh, zone out. Culture is a shared system of group-specific, notice he didn't say species-specific, of group-specific behaviors passed on generationally through social learning. He studied how wild horse bands in Galicia, Spain, rebuild socially after local human communities annually round them up, traumatically break up their bands, and shave their manes and tails. Hartigan wants us to rethink evolution as shaped by multi-species sociality as much as by environment and context. And he's using horse social cultural structure emergence after a traumatic ritual to explore his ideas. So I'm thinking about multi-species relationality, but in a different context. My research project for the last 7 years has been to explore the kinds of communicative ideologies or assumptions that have been shaping plant-human social relations in Morocco. And I do want you to understand these as social relations reproduced through social learning between and among plants and humans that is generational. I call these phytocommunicative ideologies, i.e. beliefs about plant knowledge, sociality, interaction, and communication surrounding plant-human interactions that shape conservation, consumption, and therapeutic projects in Morocco. And I've been exploring these plants as really central to sociality formations. I've previously written about the ways phytochemists or plant chemists recognized plant piety even in the absence of vocal signs, or what is known as al-ghaib within kind of a Muslim theology, or the way that botanists, biologists, and housewives engage plants as triangulating their relationships to God, indexing God's presence in their amazing natural properties. And I've written about plant-based alternative medicine in urban Morocco that is increasingly dominated by religiously committed practitioners who promote prophetic medicine, therapeutic treatments based on the practices and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, but is also backed by European and Asian-inspired complementary medicine, research and training. In each of these instances, plants' communicability models have been key to Moroccan public discourse, debates, and sociality. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of plant-human sociality assumptions in Morocco that have shaped tensions around human wildcrafting. Wildcrafting, we're probably better known here locally as foraging, right? Going out and finding stuff in your community to eat, to keep you alive. But also conservation of the Argan forest, which is arguably a really important key socioeconomic ecology in southwest Morocco. So I've already mentioned how most of you encounter Argan, which is through products here in the United States. But I also want to briefly show you some images of Morocco's biomes so that you can have something to think with as I talk about phytocommunicability, Argan consumption, and conservation in Morocco. So again, I told you I liked maps. I didn't lie. I like what they don't tell us as much as what they do. This is a map that is taught in 7th grade education in the United States about, global biomes. And this one's about the African biome. And I like how it shows they color code basically plant relatedness, right? Biomes are categorized in this map based on plant presence. So you'll see the little key down at the bottom, tropical, subtropical, moist, broadleaf forest, or conifer forest, or mixed forest, right? So the ones that Morocco is really dominant in is that orange one, which is Mediterranean forest. Sometimes, if you're from California, you know this is California coast, right? This is chaparral if you're from California. Very similar biome. And deserts, right? The xeric just meaning dry land, shrubs. And then there's some pockets of mountain shrub grasslands and shrubs, and there's a couple of pockets of temperate conifer forest, right? So this is what the biome looks like, at least on a map. This is what it looks like on the ground. So here you have the desert or xeric shrubs, right? So the dry lands, the dry areas. Most of us would think, when we think desert, Sahara, right? We're talking about the dunes. That's oftentimes the index, although here in Utah, we live in a xeric environment. We do live in a desert environment. And some of what might look more local to us is the kind of rangeland that is low-lying shrubs and plants. But there's also, in the midst of that xeric environment, and that doesn't show up on the map, are all of these oases, right, which are these pockets of heavily cultivated spaces where water is abundant. You notice people don't build on the watered areas, right? And that there's just a lot of human-plant relationality going on in these spaces. There's also cultivated Mediterranean forest, i.e., what we would call agriculture, right? And this is where you have irrigation introduced, and there's lots and lots of planting of olive trees is a big deal in Morocco. But there's also cultivated Mediterranean foresting. Again, some of our ideologies, or at least some of the ones I grew up with, is forest was separate from farmland and from garden. But in Morocco, forests are heavily cultivated, right? They plant forests on a regular basis. And then there's, of course, the Arganery, which is an area that is designated for Argan trees. But as you'll notice in these photos, it's not just Argan trees that are there, right? There's all kinds of other things in that space. But Argan has been foregrounded as really important in that particular context. Now, plants have been everywhere in anthropological studies, but in anthropology, we have tended not to spend a whole lot of time talking about plants. They're basically backdrop for human action. That has been the historical approach in anthropology, which is my discipline. And when they do make it into anthropological writings, it's almost always as a plant part. It's a cut, pickled, picked, dried, pressed, distilled plant modality, disconnected from the soil and photosynthetic growth. In fact, most of the time when we talk about plants, I don't know, how many of you, when I said the word plant, you thought of a plant that is in the ground growing? How many of you thought about the food you ate this afternoon for lunch? Okay. Jordan, yes. We oftentimes, most of our encounters with plants are in the partitioned form, right? In processed or partitioned form. But what's interesting are these ideologies about what forms plants take and whether or not a plant form can be communicative or not, right? Do you feel that your quinoa you ate for lunch is communicating with you or not? So Moroccan ethnopharmacologist Jamal Belakhdar has described North Africans' own plant erasures as a European intellectual hangover. He said plants have intertwined their logics into Maghrebi lives. The organic and nature were omnipresent from childhood stories that began with كان ومكان في القديم زمان لحبق الوسطان. It's a prophetic storytelling form that says it may or may not have been a long time ago, basil and iris in the garden of the prophet, right? Or in the low-hanging fruits that were eaten on the way to school, the myrtle bouquet that was left on the graves of grandparents, the mint gathered in the countryside and dried for winter tea, the branches used in symbolic flagellation by a zawiya, or a religious brotherhood member, seeking to drive out the devils within. This horticultural analytic, hermeneutic is the term that Argan likes to use, found its way into one of the sayings of the former king of Morocco, Hassan II, who argued famously that Morocco is a tree with African roots, its trunk in the Arab Muslim world, and its branches in Europe. Sound familiar, anyone? Morocco likes to situate itself geographically across these different domains. But beyond these kind of accounts that I've been telling you, plants are everywhere in Moroccan public discourse. 30% of the workforce currently is employed in agriculture and forestry projects. Aromatic and medicinal herbs are super profitable in Morocco. It is the 12th globally in the export of aromatic and medicinal herbs, but it's the second in export to Europe. Europeans love Moroccan's medicinal herbs. According to a report generated by a Moroccan team of scholars working under a project co-funded by the UN Development Program and their German and French counterparts, country was ranked I already mentioned that. In February of 2012, the Moroccan director of the Agency for Medicinal and Aromatic Plants placed Morocco second in the world for herbal plant density. So Morocco's just been really important for this. So let's get back to Argan trees for a moment and their oil. Here's another slide showing the kind of interconnectedness that Morocco articulates. So the green plan, Maghreb al-Akhdar, is an agricultural plan that's been going on for about 10 years now. And this was the city of Tawnat's Facebook page for about 5 or 6 years. I just think that's a fabulous photo, right, of interconnectedness. All right, so let's get back to our Argan trees for just a moment. As mentioned previously, women's relations to Argan oil have been key to the emergence of rural Amazigh women as these really central elements of conservation and desertification. Men have migrated out of these rural areas, and the women stayed at home, and they were kind of the element of conservation and desertification. As related by Zubaydah Sharuf, a Rabat-based phytochemist who served as the public face for Argan and development for the last 30 years, Moroccan women were the inspiration of her doctoral research on the chemical properties of Argan. So here's Zubaydah Sharuf. She's given talks on CNN. She's everywhere in the Argan literature and in the Argan public discourse. She knew she wanted to work on an indigenous plant, read a report by a colleague at Mohammed V University that half the Argan forest had been lost, seeking to counter the intensive agricultural export push of the post-independence government, as well as to address climate change, urbanization, and preserve the God-given wealth of the country. She decided to work on Argan. She started her research by doing field interviews with locals, and found that aside from its role as a culinary staple, right, Argan is actually the oil used in cooking, not olive oil in the southwest part of Morocco, because there's not a lot of olive trees in the southwest. It's mostly Argan. She found that it served as a topical oil to treat dry skin, acne, psoriasis, eczema, wrinkles, and joint pain. Given this preponderance of skin medicinal uses and recognizing that the shrinking Argan forest would not allow for the kind of intensive research and development that most medicinal, she found actually that it had properties that could be used for treating other illnesses, but she realized that she needed to focus on something that could be renewable and regenerable. So she focused her research on leaf and root chemical properties testing to validate what locals had said, mobilizing, and this is her quote, the exact sciences to support indigenous medicine. Now, I want to focus for just a moment on the phytocommunicabilities, right? These assumptions about plant-human relations that emerge in her narratives. Although women were the key perceivers of Argan's communicative modes, right? The fact that there's something about Argan oil that is really good for skin, her training led her to strip the various possible communicative roles or the statuses or the channels, the modalities or the scales or the frames down to one, right? She took all of this really complex relationality between Argan trees and the people who were living in the Argan forest to one thing, the active chemical compounds relevant to humans that emerged from what scholars have called plant secondary metabolites, right? Active organic compounds used to mediate ecological interactions, right? Plant secondary metabolites are those things they put off to protect themselves from other things in the environment. Within an evolutionary biology perspective, plants produce these chemical compounds to protect against herbivores, parasites, or to create mutualistic associations with pollinators and cultivators, including the humans around them. As a phytochemist, Sharuf had to find the active chemical compound responsible for the skin-based therapeutics, a process of semiotic stripping the Amazigh women's history of engaging Argan through multiple channels, through touch, right, through shade, through their organoleptics, which is their digestive system, right? Like Argan is most famous culinarily through amlou, which is a mix of the argan and honey and ground up almonds. It's amazing, by the way. You have to try it if you can get your hands on it. Olfactorily, like smell-wise, through the smoke of Argan firewood, right? There's all different ways in which they were embedded within Argan's relations. But her logic was to valorize the indigenous plant by finding an economic application. In stripping these other modes of relating and foregrounding its chemical relationality, she made possible Argan's semiotic appropriation, right? She made possible that Argan could be taken from its embeddedness in these human, non-human relations and make it transportable. And she found this problematic when I interviewed her 12 years after her initial research. She was really frustrated by the fact that many have exploited the Argan growers and the women's cooperatives that developed around this, the economic development of Argan for their own gain. It was constant tension that she had, that people would exploit the economic benefits, but without benefiting local communities. A long-term critique of development projects, right? But recent claims, really importantly, really importantly, actually, in 2006, as I mentioned, a Chilean stylist from New York, Carmen Tal, encountered Argan oil in a Mizrahi hair salon in Tel Aviv. Now, Mizrahi means Jews who came to Israel from the Arab world, right? They didn't come from Europe or from Asia or from Africa or elsewhere, specifically from the Arab world. And she found this because she got her hair treated from, she had damaged hair from a bad color treatment and wanted to come and get something to address this, and the Mizrahi hair salon had Argan oil. The shiny results inspired her to buy the small Israeli company importing argan oil from Morocco, package it in a small West Bank Palestinian territories-based factory, and export it to the US as Moroccan oil for exclusive sale in hair salons. But by branding the oil with a geographic place name, right, she called it Moroccan oil. She both capitalized on US investments in the exotic other, right? Morocco is kind of very exotic, right? Nobody would know what argan oil was. If you said argan oil, nobody would have known what that was. But to call it Moroccan oil, oh, this does something other work. But she erased really powerfully the relocated Amazigh Jews who had introduced her to the haptic, right, the touch material connections they had maintained with the oil that they had brought with them from Morocco when they relocated to Israel. Moroccan argan oil marketers were incensed, right? The Moroccans were absolutely incensed that she would call this Moroccan oil and market it because of a lot of reasons, right? That she would appropriate the national name for this product without connecting it to the country, right? They really don't like that it is disconnected from the country, from Amazigh women, or Moroccan development conservation efforts. This is a huge issue for them. This, as well as claims that Israeli agronomists had successfully grown argan trees, again, this is a real source of tension for them, led Moroccan hotel supplier Said Azban to push the Moroccan state and the European Union to assign argan oil protected geographic indicator status. Now, this is a European legal and political intervention to preserve a connection between a product, a people, and a place. So, for example, it's not really balsamic vinegar unless it's from Modena, right? Or it's not champagne unless it comes from the valley in France where champagne originated, right? Like this is a huge thing in European intellectual property, is these protected geographic indicators. Argan was the first Moroccan project to receive protected geographic indicator status. Contested, though, because it happened to occur in a bill that was lumped with a whole bunch of other trade agreements, and some folks from the Western Sahara argued that the EU couldn't possibly do that because it was a breach of EU's plans to of the European Union's politics in relation to indigenous rights and Western Sahara sovereignty, and so it's been in the courts for a really long time. 10 years. We're still working on getting protected geographic index. This move to register, right, to take a plant product through emplacement and preserve its marketability using a European Union legal code was intended to ground in a unique place argan's iconic properties, its very specific properties, communicatively available through organoleptic means, through the way that your organs, right? Skin and hair follicles, or what's known as haptic moisturizing, right? To firmly grasp people, soil, and nation. Argan oil received protected GI status in 2010 that said that any product lacking that GI label could not be called argan. So any argan oil that is produced by trees that are now growing in the Negev part of Israel, they cannot be considered argan oil, right? Because it doesn't have the GI stamp. So this is a really interesting question, right? Why promote argan oil for GI status and not some other plant, right? Why is it that is kind of seen as the most important for Morocco's GDP, despite the fact that just logistically, cork oak is far more important for Morocco's GDP than argan oil is, for a number of reasons. So one of the things that I think is happening here, and I'll kind of wrap up with that a little bit, is that it's not because they were trying to make Argan endemic to place, right? It's not that it's about Argans, that it only grows in Morocco. But there's a lot of movement happening, right, between Amazigh Jews, Israeli businessmen, Chilean stylists, that strip Argan and allow for its movement in the world. But also, really importantly, there's a lot of stuff going on with Argan itself, and it's attached itself to humans. It's communicated in all these various ways I've been talking about. It's made itself salient in all these ways, but we never talk about the communicative force of the trees themselves, and that it's their relations with the humans around it and the non-humans that has been driving a lot of environmental, political, diplomatic, and social public relations more broadly in Morocco. Now, I've only briefly mentioned French colonial and Western Sahara Argan relations, but I think a key thing that I want to impress on you is that these relations are not just about plants being backdrops to human action, or backdrops to human logics for what's happening, which has been a long-standing argument in a lot of different spheres. Perhaps we might understand plants as the focus of human discourse in public spheres just because they happen to be there a lot, right? Which is another argument that's been made. But I would suggest that these ideas about plants rely on specific ideologies of plant-human relationality in which humans are the agents and manipulate sessile or non-moving plants to their own ends. But perhaps plants have been doing stuff to us, right, all along the way, and doing stuff to the communities in which they create these relations. That is what I am really interested in looking at, is at what point do people recognize the communicability of these plants and their roles in public discourses, in publics, in conservation efforts, and at what points do they not? And make an argument that we need to expand our understanding of plants as interlocutors operating in publics. And instead of thinking of publics as spheres, which is the trope or the term that we've used for so long, talk about public sphere, I want to argue that it's a field. And when I say a field, I'm not just talking about it in the kind of theoretical sense. I'm actually talking about a literal field, right? A cultivated space, one mutually shaped by the sign affordances and processes of the plants, the soils, the terrain, the mycorrhizal networks, the climate, the pollinators, the herbivores, the animals, and others that are seeking to traverse and place and communicate in those spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're really delighted that we were able to participate in that discussion. We will go until 3 p.m. If you need to leave to a 3 p.m. class, you're welcome to leave, but we'd love to engage in a Q&A discussion. We do have a microphone right here. We'll pass it around. So if you do have a question, if you wouldn't mind just raising your hand and introducing yourself, introducing yourself as you ask that question. We'll go for about 15 minutes. Thank you.
That is quite the exodus. You must have classes to get to.
I'm Jacob Hickman on the anthropology faculty. So I'm guessing maybe this is the next step, but I'm really curious what the theory of agency or personhood that underpins the direction you're going with this looks like. Is an actor network theory conception of broadening our notion of agents sufficient for that, or what are you imagining? Where do you see this pushing in terms of how we imagine the agency or the will of plants, or maybe the personhood of plants as interlocutors with humans in these fields rather than spheres?
That is a really great question, and I'm an anthropologist, so I'm going to answer this ethnographically. I don't think that there should be a generalizable theory of plant personhood or plant agency. To me, it's really more important to attend to how do the communities that are entangled with these plants understand the agency or personhood of the entities that they are engaged with. So, for example, I'm talking Argan, right? Really long historical roots of Argan being really important to the subsistence, to the ecology, to the everyday behaviors of humans in that space. Like how they move through the fields is actually a part of how they understand the trees relating to them, right? And so for me, it's really important, part of the difficulty of conservation projects is that they don't actually take the communicative ideologies of local communities seriously. They assume a generalizable knowledge, assumption about plant agency or about human agency, and then they come in and put a project in that doesn't attest to the really complicated and complex relationalities that are there. So if you ask anybody in the Seuss about why the Argan forest is shrinking, you probably are going to get very different answers than if you ask the phytochemist or the UNESCO agency, right? And so to me, I'm not interested in the kind of what would plant personhood look like. I'm interested in, well, how does ideologies of that plant personhood or that plant agency shape the kinds of interactions that are happening, and what are the aspirations people and the plants have for their futures, right? What do they want to see happening? That's more important to me, ethnographically. Great question, though. I don't know if that's a good answer.
Rick Jellin.
Oh,
Hi,
very
Becky.
nice to meet you.
Welcome to BYU.
Thank you.
So you're probably aware the IAV has a project to do selection of Argan, to move Argan cultivation into private horticultural orchard spaces in order to help preserve the forest and expand the industry.
Mm-hmm.
What effect do you think that would have on this cultural relationship between the Amazigh in that part of Morocco and that forest? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
That would depend on who you're talking to, right? So first and foremost, Amazigh are multiple communities, and you can't just talk about one Amazigh perspective. Secondarily, which is why there is this differentiated relationship to Argan, right? Why some people are really willing to just really pull as much Argan oil as they can out of the forest and sell it to whomever they want at whatever prices, and others are really trying to preserve the forest as much as possible and to generate, keep it regenerating in multiple ways. So first of all, there's not one Amazigh perspective on this, right? It's varied. The second thing I would say is I'm not sure that the Amazigh would think of the forest as being not cultivated garden space. One of the things that is really important about this is that commoning, right, as a property practice is far more common, literally, in that part of the world than it is, for example, in the northern part of Morocco, where private property is much more prevalent. The Amazigh preserved common lands for a long time. And so for them, the distinction between cultivated private orchards and the Argan forest is not a distinction, right? For them, it's all common properties. We have a vested interest in this. We want to preserve it. The difficulty arises in the fact that, again, within the Amazigh, there's different perspectives on how do we benefit from the resources we have. And that is where the tensions are playing out. So would cultivating Argan in private orchards be a better way to preserve this natural, what are you trying to preserve? Are you trying to preserve the economic viability of this? Are you trying to preserve the plant for its potential value to science in general and to kind of the larger scientific process, or are you trying to preserve the kinds of relationality that have been there for a long time, that attend to specificities of place, to the fact that women have been a really key recognizer of the unique properties of Argan for so long, and yet their knowledge is almost exclusively undervalued when looking at a lot of the relations between the plants and the people that are engaging them. So to me, that's a question. That's a really interesting research question. I would say yes and no to your question. I think it would depend. There are definitely some Amazigh who would be open to that, right, and be very eager for that. And there are others who would not. And the question would be, from a conservation perspective or from an political economy perspective, the question would be, how can we attend to both? Yes.
Dave Johnson, Anthropology. I have a question. The women in those communities, have you explored what they actually think about the Argan plants?
So I haven't done the ethnographic work yet on this.
Okay.
A lot of this is on Argan. I've done ethnographic work on other plants. In particular, I've been working with a women's NGO that has been working with hydrosols and wildcrafting related to bitter orange, right? Ranj is what they call it in Morocco, and rose water, right? Rose water. I don't know. It's a rose hydrosol that's distilled, and with medicinal herbs. So I've been working ethnographically on other plants. This particular project is a little bit more broad because I haven't done the ethnographic work with the women yet. So I'm still I'm thinking broadly and haven't done the kind of groundedness on that. But other colleagues have done work on this. When I first started going to Morocco back in the early 2000s, Argan was within Morocco. The only thing anybody ever talked about was Argan women's development, right? That Argan was allowing women to educate their daughters, giving them economic resources to educate their daughters. And it was really, really tightly linked. That was the narrative. That's the narrative Zubaydah Sharoof has been marketing. But almost no one knows that narrative now. It's very few people. When you hear about Argan, does anybody automatically say, "Oh yeah, women's development, Morocco"? Not so much, right? And so there's been a shift in kind of thinking about the relatedness there. That is not so much about the women and their logics, which is what I've tried to get at here. Their relationality with these plants long term. There's been a shift there, and I want to go back and do the field work to understand how the communities are dealing with that post the kind of global phenomenon related to Argan.
I'll take advantage of the pause and ask one question. How has your worldview changed based on your research studying the relationships with the Argan tree?
You know, that's a really good question. It's not just the Argan tree, but I'm far more attentive to the ways in which plants have been shaping my life. I think about the fact that I choose to sit under a tree almost always when the sun is out, right? And to me, I hadn't attended to the affordances of the tree to my life until I started doing this project. I think intensely about taste and the ways that like the forms that I encounter plant products now. I think about, like my Moroccan colleagues and interlocutors are super attuned to the fact that a watermelon tastes differently when it's in season than when it's not in season, right? And what does that do? There's some sensibilities there that I think are that I have developed, or that I'm in the process of developing, because of my encounters with different communicative ideologies that people in Morocco have introduced to me. I'm much more like, they can tell the difference between olive oils, right? How many of you can do that? Can you taste the difference between kinds of olive oils? There's a very attuned sensitivity to the taste of olive oils, whether it has been, what part of the country it comes from, right? And whether or not it's been diluted with, with other oils in order to improve its marketability, right, or whatever. There's a lot of really interesting things happening there that have changed me. I attend to nuance more because of my encounters.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I know this is a different framework from what you're talking about, but I'm kind of curious if you do see a potential for direction in this area. Kohei Saito is a Japanese Marxist who, in Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, talks about the Paris Notebooks and the stages of alienation that Marx outlines. And the first one is alienation from the sensuous world. And the argument for this is look, commodification, this creation of objects, it necessitates a breaking off of relations of the sensuous kind with things like material things like argon, so that we can create it as a part to be sold, to be packaged, and very clearly a lot of purple washing going on. So I'm kind of curious, Marx and Saito argue that, Saito argues that Marx thinks that this is really, in some senses, the emergence of modernity, not just capitalism. This kind of rupture between us and the natural world, as Marx understands it, but really it's just us in a rupture from the sensuous world. And I'm kind of curious, it's sounding like it's a lot of overlap. Do you see an avenue there, or not really?
So that's a really great question, and I should talk about that at some point a little more theoretically. But I think really interesting for my Moroccan interlocutors is that they don't see it as a rupture, right? For them, plant parts are still doing sensuous work, and that they attend to that. And for them, in fact, there's a very, very, when I was doing this field work, a refrain I heard multiple times was, Europe is really interested in bio, right, the organic movement. And they will always say, well, Morocco was bio before bio, right? We were organic before organic was cool. And this ideology that they've retained that they don't see that there's been a rupture with their encounters with sensuous, with the sensorium, right? With their ways of feeling and tasting and smelling and touching the world.
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful answer. I think, kind of what I'm getting to is exactly what you just asked us previous to that, though, was honestly, I don't know if I can tell the difference between olive oils. I have been ruptured. Like a sensuous experience has been ruptured with me. But these women you're
some
talking about,
things.
possibly not.
With some things, I would say you
Yeah.
probably have. But all of us live in different worlds of encounter, right? So there's probably sensibilities with the sensuous that you are far more attuned to than I am because of your biography, right? And because of your the way that you have been socialized to see the world and to encounter it. So I don't know that there's been a full rupture. I think instead it's been partitioned in various ways, and that the partitioning is interesting. But really, what's more important is like in what ways has that rupture not happened, and why?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Becky.
Thank you to everybody for staying for our discussion. Thank you again to Professor Schulthies. Please, round of applause.
Thank you all.